stupid short!
So, we are talking the 2015 movie Bite, also known as Blood Trap. And this one stars Louis Mandylor and Vinnie Jones. Well, I say it stars Vinnie Jones. He's on the credits, but it's more of a cameo. Now, what's this story all about? And it might sound a little similar. So it focuses on a gang of criminals who decide that they are going to kidnap the daughter of a rich gangster type and hold her to ransom and hopefully get away with loads of money. Now, they hold her ransom in this particular mansion. However, this mansion seems to have a lockdown sort of installations in it, and they can't get out. And it turns out that this young girl is a vampire. And now these group of criminals are trapped in this building trying to figure out a way of defeating this vampire. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. Now, if you're thinking, that synopsis sounds a little familiar, you may be thinking of the movie Abigail, which came out in 2024. And yes, it is practically an identical premise. So much so that I can't help but think that maybe Abigail was inspired by it. Now, this isn't the first time I have seen B-movies kind of duplicated and almost remade, sometimes with other B-movies, but sometimes with like a slightly higher premise. And I presume the thinking is, because it's some kind of B-movie that barely anyone sees, not many people will notice. And I didn't know that this movie was essentially exactly the same premise as Abigail until I've just watched it. And in viewing Abigail, I've seen no one really mention this movie. So this is the way of the world, it looks like. Now, I don't know if it just happens to have been the exact same plot, or someone saw Bite and thought, I know this will be good for a kind of bigger budget unofficial remake, but whatever. So yes, it is a very, very similar plot, and a lot of the things that worked with Abigail work with this, and some of the things that didn't work with Abigail don't work with this. But let's talk about what does work in a little bit more detail, and are there any real differences? Now, the budget is obviously lower here, and the production value isn't as high, so we have to judge it on that kind of basis. You can't really judge it on a mainstream movie criteria. Now, this movie is played straight, but it definitely has a comedic edge to it. And I think its biggest strength is it's actually kind of quite funny. There are a couple of small elements here that maybe Abigail doesn't have. There is a kind of subplot involving babies. They find a bunch of babies in this house, and there's one particularly funny, albeit a little bit silly scene involving one of these babies that's actually pretty funny, I thought, I have to say, and I actually laughed out loud. There's also some other elements that I found funny. There's like a Scottish character, one of the criminals, and whenever he says something, it's comedy gold, I have to say. I think the actor was very likeable and made quite a fun character, really. There's also a couple of other kind of funny sequences. A character, because this is in an old mansion and things like that, there's suit of armours dotting around, and one of the characters decides he's going to put on a suit of armour to try and fight this vampire, but then he has to walk up like a whole bunch of stairs in this kind of armour and things like that. So there are some kind of funny elements here. And although Abigail had a few kind of like funnier moments, but I actually think this movie probably works a little bit better in regards to its comedy, I have to say. So there is that. Now, despite its low budget, I do think this movie still manages to have some reasonable kind of set pieces. I think the location shooting is pretty good, and I don't feel like you especially notice the budget all that much, to be honest. So I think, you know, it's one of these films that uses its budget wisely. Like I've said, you've got a couple of recognisable names. You've got Vinnie Jones. It's one of the kind of these criminals, but he's only in it for, you know, a cameo's length of time. But it's enough to kind of get a named person on the poster and stuff. So they've used the budget wisely to, you know, get around some of these kind of restraints here that is caused by such a kind of a cheaper film. So I think the budget has been used wisely. The plot is actually quite good. Now, you can say, oh yeah, you know, it's the same as Abigail, but this movie came out 9 years before Abigail. And obviously a lot of people lauded the movie Abigail because it was a fun premise. But this is the same premise, and this came first. So you have to give credit where credit is due. This was actually written by the director. And I checked, he's not actually credited on Abigail. So, you know, it's a fun premise. And it is it is really similar. Down to kind of some of the kind of these criminals turning into vampires and stuff. There's a lot of elements here that it's just kind of the same. So, you know, it's a good premise, a solid premise, hence why it was used again. I think the acting is, to be honest with you, relatively sort of solid here. You know, it's a cast of largely unknown, couple of recognisable faces, but largely unknown. But I think they do, you know, a decent enough job here. And, you know, the VFX-wise, maybe not as strong as Abigail, it has to be said. But nonetheless, there are some kind of set pieces and explosions and things like that look pretty good. And what I liked about this movie is they try multiple ways of trying to kind of get out of this place. And they're just like, right, that didn't work. Like, what else can we try? And things like this. So they're constantly trying different ways to kind of get the upper hand. And it's, you know, most of the time it kind of obviously doesn't really work out so well. So that was all pretty good. Where this movie doesn't work as much, I'll say right off the bat, and without saying what it is, I think the ending isn't as strong. This movie does not stick the ending as well as Abigail, to be honest. In actual fact, there's kind of like an extended epilogue that just didn't need to be there. It just didn't need to be there. It's not really capped off particularly well, I don't think. And then there has this extended sequence that was really served no purpose outside of extending the running time to a degree. So I didn't particularly like the ending of this movie, although up until that point, as I say, it's largely the same film. What else would I say is where Abigail, I think, does do a better job is the characterization of our vampire and our group of protagonists. So the vampire first. I mean, Abigail, this little girl in that movie, the 2024 one, you know, quite a, I think, well-established character in her own right. Here, in Bite, not so much. It's the vampire girl is older here. She's like a kind of an older teenager or young adult, but you never really feel like she has much in regards to sort of personality. So you don't really feel like she's a character in her own right. And then the actual decision, one thing that, again, that changes slightly to Abigail is as she changes into a vampire, she's kind of like a haggard old woman in her kind of vampire form. And so visually speaking, it's kind of a little different. Doesn't look as maybe as good as you would like. The practical makeup I don't think is particularly strong. It's the one area where I feel maybe the production budget does show a little bit because it kind of just looks like latex. And, you know, it isn't the most sort of appealing necessarily. And when you kind of look at some of the kind of like this bodysuit, it just looks like a kind of a bodysuit. So I didn't think the actual realisation of the vampire was especially strong, and it's not quite strong with the kind of the vampire lore either. I don't think people seem to, the characters don't really seem to accept that it's a vampire, even though there's clearly stuff that has been going on there. Whilst in Abigail, I think they come to the realisation a lot kind of like sooner when the obvious kind of evidence is there. And also, obviously, our group of protagonists. Again, I don't think they're quite as well fleshed out. I mean, as we go through the movie, you'll get to know some of the characters a little better, and by the end of it, there's like 2 or 3 of them I would say you kind of felt like you get to know. But it does take a while, I think, for these people to feel like characters, and certainly some of them are very much like red shirts, to be honest. So, you know, you never get quite that buy-in as you do with maybe Abigail, which I felt, you know, had a stronger sort of set of characters and built the relationships around them a lot better than maybe this one does. So, you know, it's maybe a little bit more comedic, but lacking in the kind of the characters and the kind of maybe the lore around it. But I gotta say, I actually still enjoyed this movie. You know, so you should check it out, especially if you liked Abigail. You know, here's the original, really. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Because ultimately, I think Abigail is probably stronger overall. Ultimately, it is a higher budget movie. I think it's a little bit more well-rounded than this one. But I do think this movie has like a bit better in regards to maybe its comedy. And you've got to give it props for coming up with the idea first. But it's a 5 out of 10. It's worth a watch. I mean, having a look at some of the ratings on this one, I didn't think it was rated particularly high, which I think is maybe a little unfair. But for me, 5 out of 10. But it's a strong 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.